What's up, guys? It is V here, and in today's video, I want to share with you my QuickBooks Online tips for keeping track of your PPP proceeds. But before we begin, I want to say that these tips do not substitute for working with your accountant. You really should be working with your accountant during this time. But with that said, let's get started. First thing we want to do, guys, is record the proceeds from the PPP loan. And we are going to start with recording the initial receipt. What we want to do first is create a long-term liability account. And I know some would argue that it should be a current liability because we have only 8 weeks to use it to be considered for full forgiveness. But technically, it is still a 2-year loan, so I'm going to stick with long-term liabilities. Okay, in detail type, I'm just going to select other long-term liabilities. Doesn't really matter that much. And let's call it, let's go with PPP loan. Save and close. Okay, now that we have the account set up, we want to record the receipt of the loan. So I'm going to do this by creating a transfer. Let's assume that we got the loan on April 13. In transfer funds from, I'm going to select PPP loan. That is the source of our funds. And then in transfer funds to, I'm going to select whatever bank account is holding the funds. So I'm going to pick checking. And let's assume that we received $1 million in PPP funds. And save and close. So in our chart of accounts, there it is, the $1 million PPP loan. So at this point, all we really have to do is match the transfer in the bank feed. And after that, we're not planning to touch this PPP loan account again until we find out about debt forgiveness. Okay, now we're going to fast forward to when we find out how much of our debt has been forgiven. Whatever balance is forgiven, part of that will be from the initial loan, and part of that will be interest that has been accruing on the loan. So we want to set up 2 more accounts. So the first one is going to be an other income account. And this is the account we're going to use to record the total that has been forgiven. So let's just other miscellaneous. And we'll call it PPP debt forgiveness. Save and new. And then the next one, we're going to create an other expense account for the interest. Oops. Other expense. Other miscellaneous. Let's call this PPP interest. Save and close. Okay, next thing we want to do is create a journal entry. Let's say our debt was forgiven on July the 1st. And we're going to assume that the entire loan has been forgiven, including the interest. And let's say that would be $1,667. So let's set that up. So we're going to debit the PPP loan for the $1 million. That's the full loan. Is that $1 million? Yes. We are going to also debit the PPP interest for the amount of the interest, 1,667. And then we are going to credit the PPP debt forgiven for the total. Save and close. Okay, so when we look back at our chart of accounts, there it is. It's been wiped out of our loan account. And in the profit and loss, we can see the PPP debt forgiveness and the PPP interest. Now, if it turns out that there's some part of your debt that's not forgivable, I mean, that sucks. But at least we already set it up as a long-term liability, so at least we wouldn't have to worry about any reclassifications of any balances, which now that I'm saying it, I realize it's not much of a consolation, but oh well. It is gonna be super important that you keep pristine record and documentation. I mean, that's a general rule, but even more so if you are concerned about debt forgiveness. Because I have a feeling that your records are going to be scrutinized just based on how much of the PPP proceeds were already given out. So it might be a good idea to attach a copy of your source documents to the PPP expense transactions in Quickbooks, and I will walk you through the process. Alright, so let's pretend we're going to record a payment for our electricity bill. It's going to be this bill here. Here's the bill. And here's the payment for the bill. And we're just going to create an expense for that. So new expense. Okay, so I went ahead and I filled in the expense. Make sure that the payment account is whatever account is holding your PPP funds. And then you kind of just go ahead and fill it in the expense as normal. Except that down here, you're also going to include the attachment of your source document. So it's what I showed you earlier. It's just a PDF of the bill and the payment. And it can be a PDF file. It can be a picture file, any relevant file you can attach. And then, but before you attach it, you might want to come up with some sort of naming convention. So for me, I just put PPP in the front and then the kind of expense and the payment date. So that is ready to save. So go ahead and save and close. Creating attachments in Quickbooks serves two purposes. The first one is that it keeps the source document and the record of the transaction together. And the second is that it creates sort of like a backup for your source documents. So for example, if you ever needed to download the attachments, you can just come here to the gear icon and select attachments. And then, so remember how I came up with that name convention? It's so that it's easier to sort the PPP related transactions. And so I can select the related attachments. And in batch actions, we will select export. And that will create a zip file of your attachments. My third tip is to notate each PPP related expense in QuickBooks. That's going to make it easier to track, and we'll go more into detail about that in tip number 6. But I'm back in that expense that we just recorded because I want to show you that in the description, along with the general memo, I also just added a PPP at the beginning just to notate that this is a PP related expense. For PPP purposes, if you usually combine your interest expense into one account, it might behoove you to create a subaccount for your qualifying mortgage interest. And yes, I did say behoove. So I'm just going to create a subaccount. And there it is. Okay, so on a different note, qualifying compensation is capped at $15,385 per employee for the 8-week period. So if you are planning to pay more than that, you might also want to create a sub-account for salaries and wages as well, just to separate out those qualifying amounts. You're going to want to make sure your books are up to date with all your qualifying expenses for PPP. And one of the best ways to do that is to stay on top of clearing out the bank feed. So do it as much as you can, and also keep on top of your bank reconciliations. For debt forgiveness, we need to use the proceeds within the 8-week period on qualifying expenses. So we want a way to keep track of our proceed uses. And here's how I would do it. And I'm using the assumption that any payments for qualifying expenses are coming out of our PPP funds. First, I'm going to go to reports and I'm going to select the profit and loss. All right, in the date, I'm going to select the 8-week period. So 4-13, I think we said. And 8 weeks would be June 7. I'm going to select cash basis and then run the report. But I only want to display the qualifying costs. So I'm going to go to customize. And in the filter under distribution account, I'm going to select all the qualifying expenses. So after you check off all the qualifying expenses and you rerun the report, you're going to get something like this. So you only have your qualifying expenses listed. And here is the total of how much of the proceeds we spent to date. I actually forgot one thing. I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to select percent of column and run report. So now we can see the expenses as a percent of the total proceeds used to date. Remember that at least 75% of our proceeds has to come from payroll costs. In our example, we have wages paid and we have employee health care, but other qualifying payroll costs would be retirement plan contributions. You can also do allowance for dismissal and separation and paid leave of absences like sick pay, vacation pay, etc. But it has to equal at least 75%. So I can see already that we're a little bit under, so something that you're going to want to watch out for. But now that we set up this column, it's a little bit easier to see and keep track. So we're going to go ahead and save this customization. Let's call it PPP use proceed use summary and save. The report will get updated as your books get updated. And if you want to reference your report at any time, you just go to reports and custom reports and you just click on the name of the report and there's the report. Okay, now that we have this report set up, we want to just do a quick check to make sure that the transactions that are included in these accounts are legitimate. We don't want any miscategorized transactions to have mistakenly been recorded to any one of these accounts. So we're just going to open it up to look at the detail. And then remember how we notated which transactions were PPP related. So this is why we did it, so we could do a quick check. So I can see here that one of these does not say PPP. Is there any others? No. Okay, so we have one that's PPP, or it says fees. So we just want to quickly change that to the correct account and save and close. All right, and then just do a quick double check. Awesome. This last tip is more of a general tip than a QuickBooks tip. You want to make sure that you can use up your PPP proceeds towards qualifying costs within the given period of time. And remember that at least 75% of those proceeds has to be towards payroll costs if you're planning to apply for debt forgiveness. But if I'm not mistaken, pay increases made within the last 30 days won't count towards qualifying payroll costs. So you can't just be towards the end of the 8 weeks. Oh, I still have a lot of proceeds to use up. I still have a lot to allocate towards payroll costs. I'll just give everybody bonuses. It's not gonna count. That is if I'm interpreting it correctly. So my tip is to start planning out your expenses, start mapping them out, so you have some sort of plan that you can refer to. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me in this video. Please hit that subscribe button for updates on the latest. See you later!